Good morning, all. It's 11 o'clock, and we'll start the session. Welcome to the webinar, Reimagining the Future, People's Agenda for a Post-COVID Economy. The context in which this webinar was planned is to, there was a series of webinars before this, Solidarity series, conversations during the lockdown and beyond. That was a series of webinars where the impact of lockdown was kind of discussed from many different angles, from gender aspect, impact of lockdown on capitalism, banking, a number of labor issues and marginalization. Number of issues were kind of were discussed during that webinar series. After that, a lot of people suggested that we need to kind of think beyond this, beyond in the sense, what after this, what after COVID? It's about reimagining the future, looking back at what are the kind of things which has pushed us into such a situation, and what can be the future from a people's perspective, not from the perspective of technocrats and bureaucrats. This is the 10th session in this webinar series. So far, we had a number of people coming and talking right from the beginning. Dr. Thomas Isaac, Kerala's finance minister, was in the inaugural session, and there are, along with Arna Roy, Vandana Shiva, and Prabhat Patnaik. And after that, we had a number of speakers coming here. The idea is that we bring together this agenda at the end of it, and then use it for our own kind of campaigns, in our meetings, in our advocacy, in our struggles and everything. Today's session is on digital economy. The moderator of this session is Anivar Arvind. He is a free software advocate, activist, campaigner, a very good friend, has been involved with a number of struggles against UID, Aadhaar, and surveillance technologies. He is based out of Bangalore. We welcome Anivar and hand over the forum to him.
Thank you, Joy. So, yeah. So digital economy automatically becomes a common word in many of the policy discourses these times. And if you look at, if all of us looking at the changing India's policy landscape, automatically it's a fostering digital economy becomes a keyword in many of the upcoming policies related to data, commerce, even digital payment become RBI's major agendas. So what is this digital economy is one side. The other second side, there is also another policy term evolving, which is Bharat, and which is basically Bharat with a rupee sign for R. The term is primarily pushed by industry actively, especially for an aspirational mobile user audience, smartphone user audience, which may possibly take a loan from using the smartphone apps, or something like somebody who uses smartphones for doing a lot of things. And most of the India, maybe something like 70% of India does not use smartphones. So there is a smartphone focus, digital focus policy making in one side. And we are also hearing a government frame sometimes saying that data is the new oil, and but Indians are data rich than economically rich. And the COVID crisis at this point reached at a point in which data access to data and access to people's information become a prerequisite of giving rights or services, especially including the new emergence of a passes and passes for movement and immunity passport kind of initiative, including Arogya Setu and travel passes and a lot of other supply demand side as well as the production side of economy is totally getting collapsed, and supply chain is facing issues because of the unplanned lockdown and everything. So it's a difficult time for digital economy, but at the same time, we here whatever we are hearing from government always is asking us to trust government with our data and share the data to government. And whatever the new format will be, mobile phone becomes a prerequisite to enter into this economy. I think this is a unique situation in which 70% of the population is out of digital and maybe becoming digital. I think this is a context in which I think we need to discuss this, and maybe I think Usha can maybe frame this better than me, and I think we can invite Usha first. Then I think we can go through the rest of the speakers, and possibly we can do two rounds of discussion, and then open the floor for questions. So I suggest every speaker to go with nearly 10, 20, 12 minute time, and then we can go for one more round of responses. I hope it's okay for you.
Yeah, thanks, Anirudh. I'll just start with setting out some things. I think all of us are aware of this thing that we call the digital divide. So I won't labor too much on this, and Anirudh has already referred to this extraordinary reliance on the mobile phone for everything. And I, of course, find it particularly interesting that without a mobile phone, you don't exist in this country today. So today I speak to you as the ghost that walks and talks, because since I don't have a mobile phone, that's all I can be. We also know that we have a huge literacy gap too. Of course, increasingly we are seeing that literacy is not only about being unlettered in the sense that you can't read the letters that are before you, but also that the lack of education can be something far vaster than just literacy. And we find the ability to comprehend and to creatively engage and democratically engage has not proved to be it's proving to be quite a problem for us, because when propaganda can take over, and this becomes important. The reason I mention it here is because so much of technology is used for propaganda, and we need to recognize what that means. We also need to recognize that not just in India but around the world, there is a rise of people who have no hesitation in fostering and allowing hate to become the norm. And social media seems to be using this in a huge way to promote the idea of hate, to promote the idea of othering. And then what's important in this is also that we are expecting companies and the business interest to be deciding what can be spoken and what cannot. So all our discourses that we've had on free speech and the difference between free speech and commercial speech, all of these getting completely collapsed and getting distorted in the present times when technology is mediating all of this for us. In fact, I should have said it's no longer just mediating, it's controlling much of this for us. So we do need to step back and look at many of these things to try and understand what it implies. Even for instance, this time, the television medium, the social media, and to an extent the newspaper, the print medium, but much more these two, the extent to which they were promoting the idea of the tablighi being the worst, and they're having spread it. If you didn't have social media, I wonder very much if this kind of prejudice would have been deliberately fostered by people who don't have to take responsibility for their speech. So I think there is a whole area to be looked at in terms of technology and the divide that exists because technology becomes primary. We also need to think about the changing nature of rights because of technology. It's not only about technologists saying that rights are not relevant, which they are saying, but it's also about the use of technology itself producing various kinds of issues, which it kind of pains me to say this, but as in various stages of academia and activism, I don't think there is sufficient energy being put into understanding before adopting and proliferating technology. So even amongst ourselves, I think we need to have some kind of a discussion on what we are doing with technologies, which technologies we are using and what they come to imply. Because we must remember that it's not only about our own lives, but we are placing other people's lives on these fora, which are then being controlled and managed and converted into economies or whatever else by companies, by business interests. I'll start also with saying that I don't expect business interests to worry about anything other than business. So it's not fair to say that business interests should suddenly become activists and should worry themselves about the constitution. They will not. It is for us to be able to see it and to know how to manage this kind of a situation. First of all, got to recognize what it is. Just a few things when I begin. The first thing I find most interesting, and I know that many of the people who are with us today are people who have followed the UID debate very closely and have had many problems with it. I find it fascinating that, you know, when COVID struck and we had the lockdown and you had whole masses of people moving or wanting to move, the governments kept saying they didn't know who they were and they didn't know where they were. There were at least two places where they should have known who they were and where they were. The first is something that has existed since 1979, which is the Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act. If the state had been serious about enforcing the law that it itself had made, we would have known today who the principal employers are, who the contractors are, and where there can be some responsibility placed on people. We knew nothing because they allowed loopholes in the law to flourish, and therefore there are no records of who migrant workers are, where they've come from, as communities, as classes. So that's one whole set of things where we see the state not respecting its own law and therefore not knowing where the people are. And the other is the UID. To me, it signifies the failure of a system that they said would make it possible for people to be able to access their entitlements. When the crisis struck, the system completely failed everybody. I mean, I don't have to say this, that I did not want this system to be tracking and monitoring everybody. And I had a problem with the system because it threatened to do that. Right in the beginning, we said the UID system can go in one of two ways. It can either be a very good, you know, the technology is very good, but it's bad for civil liberties and people's rights, or it can be very bad technology in the sense that it is untested, you know, just imposed on us. You don't know what it's going to do. And therefore, it is both bad technology and bad consequences. We find that it is the latter that seems to have happened. And yet, I haven't seen, at least from anywhere where it matters in terms of who makes policy, an acknowledgement that this technology that they thought would help solve problems was nowhere when the problem emerged. All they said was, show me your Aadhaar number or your card, or you will not get entitlements. You can't get onto a train if you don't have it. You won't get your rations if you don't have it. But there was nothing about how the state would be able to assist people who are in these positions of distress. So to me, it is true that I started with being skeptical about this project and being anxious about it. But to me, this, when I look at all the evidence before me, it tells me that this is a system that has completely failed the people. And it's still being pursued, and we need to understand why it is being pursued. The second thing is that all these systems are being built by private business interests. In the Manmohan Singh era, you had somebody from business coming in, bringing in people from business. If you look at it, you'll find that in the early Avatar, all the people were, so many of them were considered volunteers. They were being sponsored by the Googles and the Microsofts and the who have you. You find that the best spokespersons for this have been people like Bill Gates, who says, oh, this is a brilliant project, without really understanding what was happening on the ground with people. We've seen that this is about business, private business interest, and private business being allowed to enter government to decide what it wants to do and how it wants to collect data about us. But what is also important is that the state was both used and allowed itself to be used in promoting a project of this kind. And it happened despite there not having been any consultation, and for the longest time, there being no answers given to any of the questions that were raised. It is something that we need to remember, because all of technology is being introduced to us like this, whether it's Arogya Setu or anything else, this is how it's being introduced. We'll come back to it after a bit. The next thing to remember is that, right early in the proceedings, in 2011, you had Mr. Nilekani's committee, he was the head of that committee, the Tag Up committee, already saying that government is not capable of dealing with all the data that it has, so hand it over to private industry. So we do need to understand that it's not just about what private industry does in terms of, of what it generates as business, but also that it is saying that anything that we share with the state will hand over, sometimes not even hand over, like in GST, it goes directly to GSTN. It doesn't even go through the state in a sense. So systems are being set up, and never mind, GSTN is another case, a beautiful case of classical failure, but it will never be acknowledged as such. It is always somebody else's fault because technology can never go wrong. And that's something that we need to learn to question. See, and at this point, I just very easy to say that people who speak like I do are Luddites. The easiest thing under the sun, you put a name, put a tag, and you finish them off. But I actually think it is important that we remember that technology can only operate as a tool in our hands. It can't be a tool in somebody else's hands to be masters over us. So who controls technology? The technology controller becomes critical in this, and it is very important to remember this. There are a number of other things, but a couple more things. One is this. I think we need to go back and look at what it means about technologists as philanthropists. When, and the big difference that I see between the, oil, for instance, companies and what went before, or even say the small and like technology firms is two things. One, very quickly, you find that a transition had happened where 5 to 6 among the richest people and the richest companies in the world became technology related. So they were either technology, people from the world of technology or technology companies that became the richest. And when we say richest, we know the growing rate of inequality that's been happening. It's been enormous. It's the kind of thing where Bill Gates becomes a plenipotentiary. He stands and takes photographs, all the other heads of state cluster around him to have photographs taken. So we do need to understand what the implication of technology majors becoming the largest philanthropists means. And it is also important because these people in technology are not happy with remaining in the field of technology anymore. They want to get into education, they want to get into administration of various kinds, into health, into whatever you can think of. And not just to provide services to them, but to dictate how that should be done. In Africa today, you have Gates going there and saying how education should be done for the children. Health data is being picked up from here and being taken over everywhere. And we know that in our own country, they've been telling us forever, give us all your data and we'll create an economy, because if there is no economy, you don't have anything at all. If you don't have anything at all, there are no rights. You don't have anything else to give the economy, so give your data. So the idea of data as a commodity and the commodification of our data for the economy, which is why digital economy, it is not about just the digital, it is about the digital economy. And just a couple of last things. One is we do need to put surveillance into all of this and what it means, because this is corporate surveillance, it is state surveillance. What do they mean? What implications do they have? We do need to debate this. And the last thing that I'll mention now at this point is this brilliant thing that we see. It's really fascinating. When we go to see all these movies, and I haven't seen too many of late, but in my earlier years when I'd go for any Tamil or Hindi film, you will find that all the action will be over and then the cops will land up. That's exactly what they want to be doing with law and privacy. So all these documents will say, yes, it's very important to have a law. Yes, privacy is an issue. We will come to it. They are the cops at the end of the film. By the time they come, there is nothing that you can do anyway. It's all being done. So we do need to understand that this idea that we can defer certain things while we retain certain things is a phenomenon that has been very deliberately introduced. And it's also come because of this critical word innovation and another critical word disruption, both of which have been appropriated by the tech world, where disruption is about, which actually all of us ask for disruption in certain things. But here we are talking about the disruption being replaced, that is replacing something by technology. For instance, administering being replaced by disintermediation, where technology will stand in the place of the, that is the administrator will sit behind the computer screen and not be among the people. Because if you're among the people, you're going to be seen as corrupt. So don't go to the people. So this idea of presenceless, touchless, all these have a very different implication when you look at what this means. And innovation, they say innovation can't be stifled by rules. So don't have rules, we will innovate, and then we'll make rules which will fit the innovation. Which basically means if all rights are taken away, it doesn't matter. And one thing that we must remember is that there are many people among the common masses of this country who have imaginations which are quite simply put scary. So you'll have somebody going to the Bombay High Court and saying that, when the vaccine comes, the vaccine saying we should test it, and it's happened in the US too, where they're saying, let's go and test it on those who are in correctional institutions. So you are a bad boy and you were put into this correctional institution. Now I will come and test this on you, and that will make you a gooder person than you are now. Having people in custody and saying that that's how you're going to test things on them, this was proposed also for testing hydroxychloroquine in Worli and Dharavi slums. It is atrocious, and I really think we need to step in at this stage and stop this kind of thing from happening. Arogya Setu is one thing that they could not test on the poor because most of the poor don't have smartphones. But it also means exclusion on the other end. So let's just capture all of this together and see if, I know that I'm going to get some answers today, so I'm kind of looking forward to that.
Thanks, Usha, for this wonderful framing of how the cohesion is happening around the room, and including, sorry, it's getting unmuted, sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Usha. I think we can go to Parminder now. Parminder is part of both civil society as well as in part of some government committees, which in the digital economy. He is known as a global expert in digital economy, part of many international committees as well. He was part of the e-commerce policy drafting, draft policy on e-commerce policy, draft policy. So I think we can go to Parminder. One of the things I also want Parminder to look at it is because while we are talking about a lot of data as well as government asking us to trust on data, so there is an increasing trend of government asking rights over this data. So how much we can trust government in this whole discourse, and how trust is important in the digital economy discourse?
Thank you, Anivar. I'm only a civil society expert, and government sometimes find that they are not able to find some people who are able to deal with certain issues, and they take some of them on. And we are all full-time civil society experts, and there's no role in the government I have. So what I would talk today would initially look like a defense of the digital economy, but I assure you that it's not a defense of the digital economy, but it's a defense or a proposition about what should we do about the digital economy. And I think to be able to make myself clear, I like to go back to the industrial economy example. I mean, in 19th century, there was an industrial economy happening. Things were really bad. People were, taken away from the villages. They were put together in very bad situations in towns like Manchester, and things were changing, and colonization took place, and so on. So there were very bad things about industrialization. But if we go back and say that should industrialization have taken place or not, very few people would say it should not have. And I respect those people as well, because Thoreau and Gandhiji, for example, always knew that industrialization is so bad that they were ready to kind of stay outside that. But India became independent, took a new constitution in the 50s. We adopted a process of industrialization. We thought it was important for people to meet the people's aspirations. There may be two views about it or more, but generally we can say that industrialization itself is not a bad thing. The way it is done may be bad. In the same way, when it was taking place in the 19th and early 20th century, there were people who were resisting it, going back to the farms and going back to the nature, but others were fighting it. The Marxist philosophy or the communist revolution, whether it succeeded or not, but it gave us the welfare state, which was somewhere in between the communist revolution and the communist feudal systems. So what I'm trying to say is that digital economy is somewhat like industrialization. For us to just say that we don't like it, maybe okay culturally for some of us, because culturally, I mean, even I don't use Facebook, I don't use Twitter, by the way. That doesn't mean that I, talking on the behalf of the constituencies for which I am a civil society activist, I can say digital economy is bad, like industrialization was bad. Because they're young people, they're aspirational, they're people who are traders who are fighting battles with Amazon, they're plumbers who are being organized by Urban Clap. Just to tell them, no, I'm not going to deal with digital economy is not going to work. So all these points really bring us to what I'm trying to say is that we need to understand digital economy and deal with it. And Usha said, digital economy should not be a tool, should be a tool, but not a master. But you can't make something a tool till you understand it, because tools are also not pre-configured. Tools are made as per the work we want to do with them. And if we want to do certain works with them, then we need to understand digital economy and make them a particular kind of tools for our work, and not allow them to be our masters. And this is the kind of work IT for Change has been working on. And I'll come back to Anwar's questions about trusting government with data. And if I forget, Anwar, please remind, because I think that's important in this whole story. Now that brings to the point whether there should be digital economy or not is first point. And I did deal with it. There would be different views, but we can just not junk it, because we need to understand what digital economy is, first of all. I consider industrial economy, at the base of industrial economy, if you try to understand what exactly it is a disembodiment of physical power from human beings and animals into machines. The first time that physical power was disembodied into machines started a very powerful phenomenon, which is called mechanization, and its social and political and cultural aspects are called industrialization. In the same way, disembodiment of intelligence is called digitalization. And that would be the digital economy, the digital society, and so on. And if disembodiment of mechanization was powerful, so is disembodiment of intelligence. It has certain historic force. Just to keep on hitting in front of it and not understanding and dealing with it is not going to help the constituencies that we work with, the people on the peripheries as we all work with. So we need to understand what it is. And again, let's not talk about data. I go even further. It's not that data is being collected about us, because data looks like, well, a little kind of an innocent thing. If somebody's taken data about me, it doesn't matter much. This is intelligence about us which is being collected. This is systemic intelligence about us being collected. And the definition of digital economy is when systemic intelligence about social systems gets outsourced to outside centers. Now, these centers of centralized intelligence could be very centralized, as is the current digital economy model, or they could be distributed and sometimes federated as per the need of solving a problem. Now, whether we need distributed intelligence systems or concentrated intelligence system is my framing of the problem, and not whether we need digital economy or not digital economy, which is often framing the question. And I find that most when I'm meeting activists, and I often start looking like I'm talking on the side of the industry or the government. No, I'm talking on the same side as perhaps Marx was talking at the time when he was trying to own up industrial revolution for the sake of the workers. And we are trying to own up digital economy for the sake of those who are the outliers, as per the definition of this name of this webinar. Now, the question therefore comes when the social institutions, now industrialization changed the social institutions. It brought out new social institutions. Even the nation state in a way is really a product of industrialization. Nuclear family is a product of industrialization. The schools, as we know, are products of industrialization. The basic industrial institutions were new once industrialization took place. In the same way, digital revolution is also changing the institutional ecology of our society. And here the crucial question is, would all these institutional ecology, institutional systems be owned by the private sector, the Googles and the Ubers and the Amazons, or some of them would be owned by the government? And here we are coming to the very crucial question of our struggles against Aadhaar, the question Anivar asked, government taking our data and all that. I'm not therefore saying Aadhaar is good or government taking data is good. But the point is that like in industrial society, there was a division between public roles and private roles. There has to be division between public roles and private roles in a digital society as well. Just if we close our eyes and we say, no, no, there would be no public roles, it does not mean those roles go away. Simply it means that Google become the provider of public facilities. It's Amazon which becomes a provider of public facilities, as COVID has seen even in the US, where Amazon is replacing the federal post there. And they're putting up a new postal system in place of federal post, and they became an essential supply system. Now, if all these infrastructures go away to the private sector, and they will go somewhere, digital economy like industrialization is going to come. They can be, the routes can be changed, but the force and its efficiencies are so high that people want it. It's not I or you, but people want it. So the question is, what kind of roles we need to save for the governments in this new institutional ecology? Like in the case of industrial economy, these cannot be ad hoc. And that's the problem with our government, that these systems have always been ad hoc. They have to be rule-based, and we actually think many of these new institutions have to be constitutional institutions. We need more constitutional institutions which are managing some kinds of our collective data, and we call it data constitutionalism. This is not the time I can really get into it. But we do need public roles, because if public infrastructure and governance roles are not taken up in a digital economy, then the private sector would do it. Some global centers in the US and China will control the whole world. And when we engage with digital economy, we also have to answer these questions. And I'm therefore not saying that every activist who is fighting for Manrega on Aadhaar issues has to simultaneously also talk about it. I completely understand. The immediate fights are important, and when you are focused on that, you are focused on that. I'm not therefore saying that why shouldn't you also be talking about this, but I'm putting my perspective that some of us, when we frame digital economy discussions, we need to talk about where is it all going and what are the kind of public roles we should save, which governmental interventions we should oppose. And I'm not talking about Modi or Nirmala Sitharaman or Amit Shah. I'm talking as government as a entity, democratic government as an institution which we earned over many centuries, and what kind of public sector roles should be saved for it. Now coming to two small policy initiatives, not two small initiatives, which government of India has taken, one in which I am involved, and I have helped do a lot of framing also, if I could say it in a non-humble manner, and no other which I have not been involved. One is the concept of community data. And our organization often gets subject to so much ridicule among the civil society organizations that, well, that's what you want to do. You want to hand over the data to governments. And then I think we need to nuance it. And I again go back to when we gave ourselves a constitution, we the Republic in 1950. What is the meaning of constituting a state? The first thing in constituting a state is actually you give the state the exclusive right to legitimate coercive force. The police force is in the hands of government, and police force has much more power than data force. Police can come into my house, raid my house, and do all those things. But we still don't want that police force to be in the hands of a Google or a landlord, which was the feudal system, which was the way the law and order was maintained. You still want the police to be with the state. Now that's how it is. But we need a lot of checks and balances. We keep on fighting. We go to the Supreme Court. We want a Human Rights Commission. We are still not happy. We want further institutional systems. In the same way for data, data is also a way of coercive force. But we have to decide whether we would allow that coercive force to be in the hands of Googles and Ubers or a rule-based state. And if we would allow it in the hands of the rule-based states, what are the kind of actions we need to take to do that? So the concept of community data, which we have been trying to put forward, is that data is a commons like a forest. It's not like a knowledge. I'll share a paper with you, because knowledge is something which is really non-rival. Data is not that non-rival, because once you have one or two big companies, it doesn't matter if the same data is available to the third company. That company is simply not going to be able to do anything about the data, because the first mover has taken all that advantage. So it's more like forests as commons, as Elinor Ostrom and others have made theories around data, around commons of forests and other natural resources, we have said that data is also a commons, and that community data would be owned by the community whose data it is, not only the individual whose data it is. And one of the biggest neoliberal plans is to individualize everything. They want to individualize your political and civil rights struggles also, because individual has limited limited strength to fight against a corporation. They can always manage a individual. I'm not therefore saying individual rights are less important. They're actually more important than other rights. But what I'm trying to say is that the strategy is not to allow to have collective rights, but only have individual rights. And some of us activists fall in that trap, and we should get out of that trap. So community rights over data idea is that Delhi owns the commuting data patterns of Delhi. And if Google has been taking up all this data and possibly transferring it to Pentagon or whoever, I don't know, Delhi people have a right to say that this data, even if it is anonymized, belongs to us, and therefore through our collectives, we can impose certain conditions on how transportation takes place. And the last point I want to make before I probably will come back later is that we have also broken up this concept into very practical things. We say that Uber drivers should own the data they contribute. Now, individually, an Uber driver is asked to own the data he or she contributes. That's very easy. He has to sign off a consent form and the data goes away. We know that individual things in these kind of economic systems don't work. We say that Uber drivers collectively own the data which they contribute, and that data is the single biggest asset of the Uber corporation. And therefore, Uber drivers should have a say in decision making of the Uber company. Similar workers in a datafied manufacturing plant, because they contribute data, have collective rights over that data. These collective rights would have some governmental roles, because as we said, even in policing, government has certain roles, but it should be a rules-based and law-based roles. And these are the kind of things we talk about. And Anwar, the last question, I'm just running out of time. Trust-wise, I think nobody needs to trust anyway. The only good thing Ronald Reagan ever said was trust but verify. Now, trust is a new concept which techies have actually thrown in. Socially, it's called institutions. Institutions are systems of trust. Institutions are systems of repeated, predictable behavior, which is bound by certain rules. So we need accountable, rule-based institutions and not trust. Trust is some kind of a verbal promise or a verbal guarantee, which is really nothing in terms of large-scale social relationships. And I'll stop here, Anwar. Thank you.
Thank you, Parminder, for sharing your perspective around this. So it's going into much deeper areas and much. I think we need other perspectives to be coming in as well. I think it's not limited to just one discussion. I think, and data. I want some of the terms which is datafication or data as an asset, or all these need more data as a something. Which can be transferable, or data as a resource, or all these need questions in its own way. So if the data is something like is an extension of body, especially we are seeing quite a lot of trend of even body temperature of COVID, especially gig workers are becoming a sellable commodity for the gig economy at this point. So this is data as a resource, or data as a something which can define by the government. This is related, not just limited to data. It's also a question of software as well. So whether it is publicness of a software, or whether it is resourceful nature of data, this can government define this, or is it an action? Is it a human rights discourse, or is it a property discourse? All these are complex questions. I think we can come into that at a later point of time. Now let's go to Benston. Benston is an assistant professor of St. Stephen's College and a PhD student at DSE. He worked as a research associate in Indian School of Business, Hyderabad, for an year, and teaching in St. Stephen's from 2012. His research interests include applied microeconomics, game theory, and economics education. Over to Benston. Benston tried to be a bit brief, and since the simultaneous translations are going on, I also request you to speak a bit slowly, since there is a request from translators to go a bit slowly. Yeah. So, and you have 10 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Anu. I'll definitely keep this in mind and try to go a little slow. My training is in economics, and mainstream economics doesn't have a lot of like us these days, especially in groups, that a lot of groups that I also share. But I would like to remain within that framework and offer first the original plan with some clarity on a few concepts here, which could help explain why we see very different numbers and very different sometimes policy prescriptions coming in. And also would like to think about how economics has treated inequality in the past, and what mistakes maybe we could try and avoid when we look at this new concept of a digital economy, and maybe just hint at possible policy prescriptions, some of which has already been nicely addressed by Parminder, and I'll try to avoid those repetition. Now, if you look at the concept of a digital economy over here, now I would say it was first coined in the mid 1990s, and the definitions have been evolving since then because technology has been evolving at a very rapid pace. And if you look at the late 1990s, one would see that the focus was mostly on adoption of the internet and early thinking of its economic impact, what one would have then called the internet economy. Things have changed now, and in the past few years, we see a lot of focus on digitalization and digital transformations, on businesses adopting the new technologies, digitally intensive products and services, and also in digital transformation, which is when traditional sectors get disrupted, to use the sort of popular term here. Now, I am personally someone who believes that the most important economic changes are basically going to be, one can expect it to be through the digitalization of the traditional sectors than through the emergence of new digitally enabled sectors. I think we should be aware of this. We're not really talking about the big changes, economic changes actually coming in from something immediately coming in from something like robotics. But I would say that the serious economic changes of displacement of labor, of unemployment may be coming in, disruption in how value gets distributed. These are all basically going to come in through the digitalization of the traditional sectors more than these sort of new. I'm someone who believes that that's something that we should be seriously sort of worried about and thinking about. As Parminder also said, there are certain things that we can't really deny, but we should be better prepared to handle those things. Now, if you look at the main components of the digital economy, we would see that there are certain core aspects or foundational aspects. This would include fundamental innovations, core technologies, the enabling infrastructure like internet, etc. Then there would be digital and information technology sectors, which borrow almost directly from core aspects and produce their products. Then there is a wide set of digitalizing sectors that we have. And these include sectors where digital products and services are being widely and increasingly now being used. Now, the proposed definitions of a digital economy would be closely linked to these components. And hence, measuring the digital economy is going to be a very tricky issue, because there is not an agreed upon one definition of what digital economy is. And in several underdeveloped, developing countries, we don't really have the statistical infrastructure to measure some of these things well. And add to this spillover effects and intangible outcomes that you may have, and which are plenty when it comes to something like the digital economy. Now, let me just quickly give you a couple of definitions that I've also come across. The point is very simple, and it's not really to get into the details of these definitions. But one definition, for example, Bucht and Heath in 2017 says that the digital economy is that part of economic output deprived solely or primarily from digital technologies with a business model based on digital goods or services. I would call this a narrow definition. And that's how literature, not just me, but literature has basically called this some kind of a narrow definition. Nikram et al. In 2016 has a very broad definition, where they say the share of total economic output derived from a number of broad digital inputs. These digital inputs include digital skills, digital equipment, and the intermediate digital goods and services used in production. Such broad measures reflect the foundations of the digital economy. That's what they sort of say. It's a very broad definition, and there are several other which could be classified as maybe narrow and broad definition. My point is very simple. Now, based on this definition, then the estimated size of the digital economy would vary considerably. Now we are talking about something like 4.5% of the world GDP to something like 15.5% of the world GDP. For example, US, if you look at it, a narrow definition would give us that the digital economy has a size of 6.9% of US's output GDP, and a broad definition would give us 21.6. China, similarly, a narrow definition would give us 6% and a broad definition would give us 30%. Now, we need to be clear about what exactly we are talking about when it comes to the digital economy. What are we including? What exactly are we talking about over here, to then draw conclusions from there or prescribe policy. Because this, we still don't have an agreed upon definition, and these measurements vary considerably. So we need to be, we shouldn't actually be overestimating something or shouldn't be underestimating as we really know, but the focus should be on then to be careful with these numbers that we have and know exactly what we are basically talking about. Now, compared to the conventional economy that we have, how does the digital economy basically create value? Now, they create value from data and from digital platforms. Right? And these are two sources which are seriously sort of, which contribute to value creation within the digital economy. Now, platforms, digital platforms could be transaction platforms that we see, which are used by business models like Amazon, Facebook, Uber, etc., where you bring in different sides of the markets and different markets and let people interact. Or it could be innovation platforms like operating systems like Android or Linux, etc. That could be platforms. Now, again, one needs to be careful over here that we have to understand that there are very strong network effects and also strong lock-in effects in platform growth. Now, this basically means that the more users that you have, the value actually increases. And the lock-in effects basically mean that when a user is already locked into, is part of a certain platform, he uses it, there's going to be a cost involved in switching over to some other platform. And that would also, this cost is not necessarily explicit cost, it's a huge implicit cost, but we have to consider that. And growth of these platforms are basically very strongly linked to their capacity to collect and analyze digital data. Now, and when it comes to the importance of data over here, one needn't stress it any further. Like you already had an expert speaking about what exactly data is. But again, we'll have to make a distinction between like how data, what data is basically, and then how data gets transformed to something like information through maybe aggregating or ordering that we use. And then how in turn that information gets used in people's experiences or models, which basically then contribute to knowledge. What exactly has, when is the real value get generated over here? Does a data source basically have a lot of value over there? Or is it basically the knowledge that comes out of it that we should be worried more about when it comes to attaching value? And ownership issues, as we have seen, are also going to be plenty. And big data is another term that we hear a lot. It's a very popular term, but the big could be the volume of data, big could be frequency of data, the big could also be the variety of data that basically comes in. And knowledge is certainly something which is going to create value over here. And the non-rivalness, wherever it exists, is basically going to have serious implications for value sort of generation. Now, but when it comes to personal data, then we see that there is going to be a lot of issues, especially when it comes to privacy. And we see not a lot of trust when it comes to privacy in many of the surveys. For example, the Center for International Governance Innovation study found that in 25 economies, 78% of internet users basically were concerned about their privacy online. Countries like India, Hong Kong, Mexico, these numbers up at 90% or more than that. One needs to think about how, and maybe this is a forum which could be used for something like that, how increased public scrutiny could put maybe the right pressure on firms whereby they would internalize the protection of privacy, because there would be serious reputational benefits. Now, you don't handle data well, you misuse it, and if increased public scrutiny is then going to be there, and if the firms could be penalized, they're going to be worried about that, and naturally it sort of comes in. And how exactly does COVID basically come in over here? Because this is basically what the digital economy is all about now. But the pandemic and subsequent policies have certainly increased our dependency on the digital economy. There's no denying that. We like it, we not like it. We're very dependent now on the digital economy. And we've just seen that whether it is education, work, shopping, healthcare, entertainment, there looks like there's a digital twin, unlike a couple of decades ago. But there's no escaping the fact that this twin doesn't exist for a significant global population. Now, how do we address this is basically one serious question that we have. Now, the global internet protocol traffic data, the way it has evolved is astonishing, because you're talking about something like 100 GB per day in 92. In 10 years, it becomes 100 GB per second in 2002. That's the internet traffic that you're talking about. In 2017, it becomes 46,600 GB per second, which is estimated to be 150,700 GB in 2022. Now, this is largely sort of concentrated in two countries. And this is, inequality has been like a research interest for me. And one really has to be concerned about it's not really a classical north-south divide that we really see over here, but it is US and China. It takes away 75% of all patents related to blockchain technologies, 50% of all spending on the Internet of Things, 75% of all the cloud computing market, 90% of the market capitalization of the world's 70 largest digital. The examples are plenty. And you're talking about Africa and Latin America together having only 1% of this market capitalization of the digital platforms. The divide is much deeper than this. We know that in the least developed countries, only 1 in 5 people are online. There's a serious gender sort of gap also that comes in. At a more micro level, factors like income, location, age, skill levels, gender, physical disabilities determine to a great extent this divide. India, where 66% of our population live in rural India, we are talking about an overall internet penetration in India 48.4. That's out of 100 people, 48.4 has internet access. It's only 25.3 from the TRI data for rural India, while it is 97.9 for urban India. Location matters seriously over here. A GSMA study in 2019 tells us that only 16% of Indian women use mobile and internet services. And again, among women mobile users are 56% less likely to use mobile internet services. Now, when it comes to treating inequality within the discipline of economics, for years we were dominated by an idea that there is an inverted U shape that inequality actually takes with development, that it will worsen in the beginning and then it will sort of improve, inequality would come down. This was known as the Kuznets curve or the Kuznets hypothesis. And now serious studies followed, and especially Piketty's study, I'm not getting into the details over here, but shows us that there's nothing automatic over here. He shows that inequality basically responds to what policy tries to do. You try to address it seriously, well, inequality has responded, it has come down. You leave it untouched, there's nothing automatic taking it towards lower levels of inequality. Digital divide is also going to be something like that. If left unchecked, it's going to seriously grow, and there is going to be further implications for economic inequality. Now, I'm a student of mainstream economics. We have the first and the second fundamental welfare theorems, as we call it. And the first theorem basically talks about, under a large number of assumptions, the market outcome is going to be an efficient one. Efficiency, of course, defined in a very sort of narrow sense. If you have 100 rupees and a division of 100 and 0 is also something which is efficient. But, and people say, a lot of people derive their belief sort of in economics, unfortunately, from this first theorem, which talks more about efficiency. But it's very clear that there is a second welfare theorem, which talks about the fact that among the efficient outcomes also, there may be outcomes which as a society, which we don't really like. So we can pick whichever, among the set of efficient outcomes, whichever we want, we can sustain that as the market outcome through a set of lump sum transfers and subsidies or adjustments to what is known as people's endowments, the economic agents' endowments. The skills is going to be one real endowment that we have to talk about over here. Digital skills are basically going to be an important part of this endowment, and that's where governments will basically have to come in. Civil society will have to come in. The collective bargaining will have to take place right now, and international bodies will also have to do a lot more over here. Now, ensuring affordable and reliable connectivity still remains a major challenge in many places. There needs to be more dialogue. There needs to be more consensus building and policy making at the international level too. We have to boost entrepreneurship. We have to know that we're really dealing with something that's already there, and everything that is characteristic of this disease and the pandemic is going to make this be part of the new normal, at least for a significantly serious amount of time. Boosting entrepreneurship and empowering like women entrepreneurs, identifying key market opportunities. This need not be robotics, but it could be something which operates at a very local level, but that could be exploited in local economies. But we have to reform competition laws and regulatory frameworks, because we're really dealing with something which is at the very early stage of development, but could seriously have implications for the days ahead. I would like to end over here, and when it comes to policy making and maybe a model from Kerala is something that I would like to discuss if there is a second chance that comes my way. Thank you.
Thank you, Benson. Since I think we are going a bit over the time, I think we can we need to go for 2 more speakers, and then I think we will address the questions in the next round directed at speakers. If you have any questions specific to any speakers, you can ask them in the group chat. Next round, we will go to each speaker with the questions. So now I think Vineet is here, and Vineet Bambu is a Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangadan activist. So so he is a trained software engineer, and he was working in US earlier and then joined with MKSS. So he is also part of Digital Dialogue team in Rajasthan, which helped in building the Jan Sujana portal for the state. So, and he is ways in which digital technology can empower the ordinary citizens, and working closely with various mass movements and workers. So over to Vineet.
So Anivar, before I speak, I just wanted to make sure. Chatar Singh and I, how much time do we have in total? We want to just share. Maybe he will speak in between, and then I'll wind up.
So yeah, I have 10 minutes or 15 minutes. If you can share, both of you can share in 15 minutes, that's fine. Otherwise,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So, so far we have covered different perspectives, and my perspective will be very close to people, because we work very closely with the people. And even the very first fight of MKSS was about transparency and accountability. So I'll start with that. Because there is centralization of power, because there are a lot of inequalities, and it seems like same is happening with digital economy also, because there is such a digital divide. This digital economy is working very well for some people, but for other people it's becoming a barrier. We covered few things, like we touched upon privacy aspect, we just little bit talked about surveillance. What I would like to cover on is little bit about how people can get their entitlements, or how technology can be barrier in getting those entitlements, as well as the exclusion part. Because the people we work with, very important thing for them is whether they are getting their entitlements or not, and how, if a technology is being adopted, whether that technology is helpful in reaching out to those entitlements, or if it's becoming a barrier. I'll give you an example of biometric authentication in ration shops. So sometime back, about 3 years back, Rajasthan adopted biometric authentication. Earlier, there used to be a physical register. You go and sign in, get your ration. Now you have to put your biometrics to get ration. Point of sale machines have been installed. There are multiple things involved in this. First of all, the capture of biometrics when Aadhaar was made for that person, whether the quality of biometrics was good enough to authenticate them. Second thing is, if you want to authenticate, whether you have connectivity, whether you have infrastructure in place. Third thing can be whether that person has accessibility to that place. We meet some people who are unable to go to the shop. Either they are elderly or they are ill, so they are getting excluded because they can no longer go to the shop to put in their biometrics. So some of these things have excluded, though it might have reduced corruption to some extent, and that too up to an extent, I'll say, because ultimately it depends on the intention. If intention is right, these things will work fine. Technology is a tool, so the way you design it, you might have heard of artificial intelligence, all the algorithms working. When we design them, we put in our own bias there as well. So everything we are designing, even there, has some human bias programmed in it. And it's important for these things to come out to be very transparent, how that decision making is taking place. One thing which Rajasthan did is there are customer service centers and people can take license. It's a commission based work rather than government providing those services, and it's happening in almost all the states. These customer service centers are called e-Mitra. So the services are being provided by e-Mitra, and we also took one of the license, and Chatur Singh runs that e-Mitra. Now, the argument was these e-Mitras are created to provide better service to the people, doorstep. They don't no longer have to come all the way to government offices. Anyone wants to apply for e-Mitra license can apply, and it's a competition-based model, commission-based model, so anyone can apply for it, and whoever is providing better services people will go to them, and it's all depending on that, their profitability will be decided. So I'll request Chatur Singh to just explain a little bit about his experiences and how it can be both the aspects, how we have been able to help as well as what problems we have faced. तो चतर सिंह जी, आप थोड़ा बता देंगे ई-मित्र के बारे में, और थोड़ा सा आपका जो अनुभव रहा है, जो परेशानियां भी आती हैं और किस तरीके से उसमें हमें कुछ मदद भी लोगों को हम दे पाए हैं, उस बारे में.
Yeah, Chatur Singh, yeah, he is an e-Mitra. E-Mitra is basically a single window system of government, and he runs this in a daily basis, basically, and he is active with the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan. So effectively, this is basically e-Mitra is something like a single window system which basically do the citizen services. So Chatur Singh can share his perspectives and complement especially what Vineet is saying. Vineet is funded input from Chatur Singh as well.
जी, मैं मजदूर किसान शक्ति संगठन का एक ई-मित्र है, और इस ई-मित्र को मैं चलाता हूं ताकि लोगों को एक ही छत के नीचे सारी सुविधाएं मिल सके. डिजिटल के बारे में अगर हम बात कर रहे हैं तो ये सोचना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि हमें लोगों को कितना हम फायदा पहुंचा सकते हैं। सरकार ये सोच करके चलाती है कि एक ही छत के नीचे जो गरीब हैं या मजदूर हैं, जो लोग लंबी कहीं दूर ऑफिस है वहाँ नहीं जा पाते हैं सरकारी कार्यालय में, तो वो ई मित्र के माध्यम से अपना काम करवा सकते हैं। लेकिन इसमें जब हम ई मित्रा का जब हम काम करते हैं तो लोगों को इसका कोई टाइम पीरियड कोई फिक्स नहीं होता है कि आपने जब आपका एक राशन कार्ड के लिए अगर आपने आवेदन किया है तो वो कितनी बार आएगा, एक बार में उसे काम उसका जो काम उसने जो दिया है वो होगा या नहीं होगा। क्योंकि कुछ टेक्निकल प्रॉब्लम ये होती है कि ई मित्र में जब आप किसी चीज़ को प्रोसेस करते हैं तो या तो कभी नेटवर्क नहीं चल पाता है या कभी किसी कोई कारणवश से कोई काम नहीं हो पाता है। तो ये सारी चीज़ें कभी-कभी टेक्निकल चीज़ में भी प्रॉब्लम करती हैं और लोगों को 1 से 2 या 3 बार चक्कर काटने पड़ते हैं। दूसरा ये कि आप अगर कोई काम पैसों का लेन-देन कर रहे हैं तो आपको अपना आधार कार्ड लाना पड़ेगा, फिर आपको बायोमेट्रिक से पैसा लेना पड़ेगा क्योंकि कम पैसा अगर आप बैंक से आपको पैसा मिलेगा नहीं, आपको बीसी के माध्यम से पैसा लेना पड़ेगा। तो वहाँ कभी-कभी ये होता है कि या तो उनका फिंगरप्रिंट मैच नहीं करता है या बीसी वाला ई मित्र वाला कहेगा कि आपका अंगूठा काम नहीं कर रहा है या कहेगा कि यहाँ इंटरनेट की प्रॉब्लम है, आप आज नहीं कल आइएगा। तो ये कभी-कभी दिक्कतें ई मित्र के माध्यम से भी होती है।
थोड़ा सा आप जवाबदेही के बारे में भी बताएंगे चतुर सिंह, जैसे आप कोई अगर एप्लीकेशन डाल रहे हैं तो आपकी क्या जवाबदेही है और उसमें सरकार की क्या जवाबदेही है?
दूसरा ये कि अगर आप टेक्निकल चीज और एक छत के माध्यम से सारी अगर सुविधाएं देना चाह रहे हैं तो अब इसमें हम ये नहीं कह सकते कि आपका कोई फिक्स सरकारी रेट तो है फिक्स कि आप सरकार ने जो तय कर दिए हैं दर कि आपको इस काम करने के लिए आपको इतना ही पैसा लेना है, लेकिन ये फिक्स नहीं है क्योंकि अब जब आप किसी ई मित्र के माध्यम से काम करवाते हैं तो वहाँ पे भी मनमाना वसूल जो राशि है वो वसूल की जाती है। तो एक तो सरकारी ऑफिसों से इन लोगों का जो संपर्क है वो टूट गया। दूसरा है कि आप किसी के माध्यम से काम करवा रहे हैं तो भी आपको पैसा देना पड़ेगा और कोई फिक्स नहीं है कि आपका काम 1 दिन में हो जाएगा या 2 दिन में हो जाएगा।
तो हाँ, ठीक है। तो आई जस्ट लाइक टू
ये हमें
ऐड
सोचना पड़ेगा कि हम टेक्निकल चीज में और कैसे इसको अच्छा कर सकते हैं ताकि लोगों को और ज्यादा फायदा हो, क्योंकि हम बड़े स्तर पर सोच करके ये निर्णय ले लेते हैं कि ये अच्छा है, हम इसे लागू कर लेते हैं, लेकिन हम हकीकत स्तर पर लोगों की क्या समस्या है उस समस्या को हम नहीं समझ पाते हैं। जब तक हम ग्रामीण क्षेत्र के लोगों की समस्याओं को नहीं समझेंगे कि उनकी क्या समस्या है और वो क्या चाहते हैं, वो किस तरह का डिजिटलाइजेशन चाहते हैं, कि वो क्या चाहते हैं कि हमारा काम कितने दिन में हो जाए, उन लोगों की जो समस्या है उनको मद्देनजर रखते हुए अगर हम डिजिटलाइजेशन को और आगे बढ़ाते हैं तो मुझे लगता है कि ये सबसे बड़ी उपलब्धि होगी।
ठीक है
तो
चतुर,
हमें
थैंक यू।
जमीनी स्तर पे लोगों से मिलना पड़ेगा और उन लोगों की समस्याओं को सुनना पड़ेगा कि आपने कोई काम करवाया है तो आपको क्या समस्याएं हुई हैं और आप क्या चाहते हैं। ये सारी चीजें उन लोगों से सीख करके हम अगर डिजिटलाइजेशन के रूप में अगर हम आगे बढ़ते हैं और सरकार के साथ अगर हम बात करते हैं या डिजिटल को और आगे बढ़ाना चाहते हैं तो हमें जो जमीनी स्तर जो ग्रामीण क्षेत्र के जो लोग हैं उन लोगों का हमें सहारा लेना ही पड़ेगा, क्योंकि बड़े बड़े स्तर पे तो आपको इंटरनेट की सुविधा मिल जाएगी, आपके पास अच्छे स्मार्टफोन है, आप स्वयं आप गूगल पे जाके सर्च करके आप अपना स्टेटस चेक कर सकते हैं। लेकिन ऐसे गांव और ऐसी ढाणियां भी हैं जहाँ न तो इंटरनेट है न उनके पास मोबाइल फोन है, अभी भी ऐसे गांव है जहाँ बिजली तक की सुविधा नहीं है। तो उन लोगों को अगर हम ये कहें कि आप डिजिटलाइजेशन हो गया है अब आपके लिए ये समस्या का समाधान हो गया, तो मुझे तो नहीं लगता कि जब तक उन लोगों को फायदा नहीं मिलेगा डिजिटलाइजेशन का तब तक कोई समस्या का समाधान नहीं है। आज भी राजस्थान सरकार ने एक जनसूचना पोर्टल लॉन्च किया हुआ है, बहुत अच्छा पोर्टल है। हम लोग हमारे पास आते हैं, हम उन लोगों को बताते हैं कि आप भी अपनी ये जो कुछ भी हो सकता है, पालनहार हो सकता है, आपका पेंशन हो सकता है, आपका जो राशन है वो हो सकता है, आप स्वयं चेक करिए। अधिकतर गांव वाले लोगों की यही समस्या आती है कि मेरे पास ऐसा फोन नहीं है, या मेरे पास इंटरनेट सुविधा नहीं है, या हम ये सिर्फ शहरों तक ही या बड़े बड़े शहरों तक ही डिजिटलाइजेशन कर रहे हैं। जब तक हम जब तक हम गांव के लोगों तक ये नहीं पहुंचाएंगे कि आप ये देखिए, आप इसमें आप अपनी सारी चीजें चेक कर सकते हैं, तो ये मुझे नहीं लगता है कि हम डिजिटलाइजेशन में और कुछ कर पाएंगे। और अगर ये लास्ट में मेरा एक ही है कि अगर आप अच्छा करना है, डिजिटलाइजेशन को और आगे बढ़ाना है, तो बिल्कुल ग्रामीण क्षेत्र में जो लोग रहते हैं उनकी समस्याओं को देखते हुए हमें डिजिटल के इस कदम को आगे बढ़ाना पड़ेगा।
तो ठीक है चतुर, तो इसी में एक चीज आई विल लाइक टू ऐड वन मोर thing to what Chatar Singh said. As he said, he talked about Jan Suchna portal. So when this thing lockdown was happening and government was coming out with schemes which will benefit public, we requested them to put in public domain. For example, they are giving a cash transfer of 2,500 rupees to us people with certain eligibility. So we requested them, okay, put this out in the public domain so that at least it's clear to me whether I have received that money or not. So now when we go to village, we can talk about this, that government is transferring this money. You can go to Jan Suchna portal and look out in its list whether your name is there or not. In some instances, we also found if for certain people the name was there but the transfer did not happen. So there's a toll-free number where you can put in a complaint, and after they put in a complaint that they made the transfer. So in some aspect it helps. Similarly, during COVID, over 20 lakh people in Rajasthan registered either to go out of state or come to Rajasthan as part of migration. Now, the problem was after this registration, it wasn't managed well. So these people, they lost faith in government and they kind of either walked by foot or whatever means by they found. But if this could have been managed better, these 20 lakh registration happened through either through a phone line or through a portal. So it's a big number. 20 lakh people is not a small number. And this helpline was monitored initially. There were a lot of calls on this. The people were unable to make the calls because it was so busy. So we monitored, and so in one way this helped to register 20 lakh people, but on other side, because it was little mismanaged, these 20 lakh people were not able to comfortably go to their places. So I would like to conclude with this to say that some of these technologies, even like Aadhaar, there have been a lot of problems we have been facing with people we work with based on Aadhaar-based payments. There's an entity, NPCI, which is not accountable to anyone, and they are the major entity in these transfers. So major thing is there has to be accountability, and as you privatize more privatize more data, it seems like lesser control we have on accountability. So the main focus should be, as we digitize more, there should also be focus on control on data, transparency, and accountability. So over to you, Aniva.
Thank you, Vineet. Vineet raised many important points in the last mile and especially on the benefit transfer. We have seen at almost a decade of Aadhaar in which...
Hello?
Yeah. Am I audible? Just a minute, yeah. Yeah, hello. Am I audible? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, Anivar, you're audible.
Yeah. So we have seen a decade of Aadhaar in which the state changed from an identifier provider to it becoming last mile.
I have more
built
time.
a lot of... Hello, yeah. So we have seen a yeah, I think. Okay. So can you mute
So
Vineet?
till Anivar comes and stops me, I'll keep talking. If you
Yeah. Thank you, Vineet. So yeah, we will come back to each and every speaker with questions. So what I'm just trying to tell, we have seen a decade of state which is moving from a lot of open frameworks to a trust deficit manner over a period of 1 decade by pushing quite a lot of even along with Aadhaar. So now even during COVID, what we are seeing is AEPS is getting expanded. The last mile cash access is getting very difficult for most of the people. Cash out services of government as well as the banks are getting uh, they are not going, basically the ATMs are not getting filled. So the dependency on AEPS is increasing. At the same time, it's a touch and transfer. Biometric is automatically creating a situation in which even COVID can spread. So this is a complex scenario. In the name of digital economy as well as the digital expansion, there is a complex situation of the last mile, how the last mile can be supported or not is not a much policy priority, other than what more concerned most of the time is about the growth curves of the state. Anyway, let's go back to the questions. I'll read out the questions to each speaker and go to each and everyone. So there is some common question to speakers. One common questions are this. Himanshu Damle asks, I think biggest hurdle of digital or data economy is the absence of open marketplace. So data acquisition is not only an expensive affair, it also gets caught in moral, legit, technological and market dead ends. Though technically blockchains could go around these dead ends, these still are only catching up. So what are the speakers think of such a marketplace coming up and the problems thereafter, where data start getting transacted like commodities on the commodity market exchange? Ashish Kotari asks, industrialization that displaces primary sector activities and unendingly exploiting nature is certainly fundamentally problematic. So if digital economy does not respect equality, justice, and ecology, it is also inherently problematic, which does not mean, of course, what we want to reject it completely, but in whose control, for whom, with what cost, who pays the cost, etc. has to be central part of it. Joseph K. Anthony says the technology exists to ensure complete control by the user over data. The legal rights should be clearly established and enforced. Is there any issue on this? Now the technology exists. So, and there is specific question to Usha. Thomas Franco asks, with increased cases of fraud, is it time we need to pursue the case once again? Anushka asks, does digitally imposed mediated polarization flow the non-digitally connected sections of the society as well, given the huge digital divide? If yes, it is not only very worrying, but also indicative of how the spillover affects the society at large. Have any studies have been done for this aspect? Ashok Chaudhary to Usha, has Aadhaar become irrelevant? If so, then what would happen to the huge accumulated data of the government and companies? So it's quite a lot of questions. The generic question anyone can pick, but let's go to Usha first, and Usha can address this, and it will be good if you can limit it into 7 minutes because we are going a bit out of time.
So just a few of these things. There is actually an enormous amount to say, but obviously there isn't enough time to say it. So I'll just try and capture some of the basic things that will partly answer the questions and partly address what the others have also spoken. The first thing I want to know is, want to talk about is this, that how much evidence is enough to say that a certain kind of technology is not a technology that should be deployed in any setting. I think Vineet spoke about the problem with biometrics. I just want to quickly say this, that biometrics was adopted without knowing whether it can work in the on the Indian population. And it was adopted because the immediate interest was in giving everyone a unique number. Uniqueness was not about biometrics because you did not know how it would work. It was about giving everybody a unique number. So we are all to be numbered. I think we need to understand that technology is not just about technology. Technology is politics. And it's not being given to us as technology, but it's being given to us as politics. And that's the reason we need to address it politically and not from just within the technological arena. So there has been a whole host that has happened on biometrics from the beginning, from 2009. Someday we will go over all of that. But today, just to say that the latest that happened last year was finally having seen that biometrics does not work. It's going to be a problem. Many people have problems. There are these letters that have now been issued by various state governments saying that for one nation, one ration, which is what they are talking about in the context of COVID, saying that, you know, migrants anywhere should be able to collect their rations. In the entire reliance, the whole reliance on that is on the UID and on biometrics. And since they recognize that biometrics does not work for many people, they actually have these letters going out saying for a range of families, if it's a one person member family, if there are 4 people, but you know, all of them are above 60 or below 15, if they are 4 people and above, but you know, their biometrics do not work, none of their biometrics work, and so on and so forth, then they can nominate somebody whose biometrics will work for them. How much clearer can they get in telling us that biometrics has not worked? How can you start assigning your identity to somebody whose biometric has to work and who will then control who you are? It is so bizarre. And okay, so you use that in PDS. You also use that in a banking system and say that when the banking correspondent comes, they can put their fingerprint and collect the money. So it is a bizarre state we are in, where, you know, this is really not about technology. In one sense, in this country, I think it has been badly done because they push the technology into the field even without testing it. And so we are seeing many failures of technology. I think we need to acknowledge that, because even as tools, they are not good tools. And somewhere we need to be able to talk about it without thinking of it as, does it work a little bit here? Can it help us there? Can we do this? We need to first figure out how much evidence is enough for us to understand that certain things are simply not a good idea. The second thing is on the Industrial Revolution. Parvinder, I find it really interesting you say this, because I think climate change is all about battling what the Industrial Revolution did to us. Inequality is all about what climate change has done to us in a different form. The idea that companies, you know, among the worst things that we have discovered in these recent times is this idea of the limited company. You know, the limited company, which is limited by liability, but not limited by the amount of damage it can do. Not limited by the kind of profits that they can make. And everywhere we look around us, we are seeing the problem of the industrial age. We are seeing the problem of the industrial and the oil age. The whole of the last century was dominated by wars which oil created. And this data is considered the new oil. So what really are we saying when, you know, after all, we could not, you know, we didn't stop. So this idea, you know, that it can't be stopped, it will come, and therefore let's now learn to live with it. I think that's a defeatist attitude. And it's also something where we are saying, it's all right. You know, our lives will get damaged to a greater or lesser extent. Let's try and limit the amount to which it will get damaged without even a debate. The third thing is what was said about rule-based states. Now, if there is one thing that has been established in the past 10, 20, 30 years, especially since liberalization started, it is that rules do not apply to states. And the states will decide to whom rules apply. The illustration that you gave of the police too, in fact, there are very serious conversations going on about the disbanding of police forces everywhere in the world. Because what has happened with the police forces and with the kind of power that has got aggregated in the police force. These are important debates which we need to understand before we think it's all right to adopt them and put them on to. See, the thing about the tech thing I find is that it's presented like, you know, these are good guys who are doing it and they can't do harm. And the second thing is technology itself is not harmful. And therefore, it's all, you know, let's just try to figure out how to tap it around. And that neither of which is necessarily true. One other thing is this thing of what Comrade Franco was asking about, which is on whether it is time for us to revisit it. It most certainly is. we have to build up a discourse so that people understand what we are saying. First, we need to understand it amongst ourselves. I think we are also, because technology is a difficult thing to grapple with. I actually find that not using so many of these and all the time, I use a lot of technology, but I don't use all the technology and all the time really because it's there. It's helped me keep a distance from these technologies so that it's possible to question them and not necessarily have to adopt them. Each of us will have to find our own strengths in how we learn to how we learn to question and interrogate. It's not about trashing, it's about interrogating these technologies. And I am going to repeat this, that I think we do need to pause and think about what it means when our largest philanthropists are people who are trying to make the most money out of these kind of technologies, which are going to impact not just technology and its use, but also the various fields in which they want to introduce it, including health, education, and all the rest. In labor, for instance, they've been saying there's no need for labor to migrate at all. Why is labor bothering to migrate? You put yourself on the grid. Actually, if you remember, during the COVID period, when they said that now workers can go back, and then they said, no, you can't go back. And they said, you stay where you are within the state, give your name, give your identity number, and give your skill, and then you'll be deployed wherever you are. Such a dramatic way of reducing a citizen to a laborer and having no other identity but as someone to contribute labor, I have not seen, in independent India at least. And the last thing, which is, on function creep. See, we do need to acknowledge that when we have all these, when we have all these databases being created, to think that this will not result in function creep, where various people with various intents are going to use these data for their various purposes. I think it's, you have Arogya Setu, it is a tracing app, it also becomes a tracking app. You have things being put out saying that this is only to deal with terrorism, and then it becomes anything at all. If you have it, you will use it. So we do need to consider whether, and you know what Parminder said about it being actually about intelligence. It's not just data, it is about intelligence. I think it's a very significant statement, because they're basically saying they want to know us better than we are allowed to know ourselves, and we will ever be able to know ourselves. And the only way we can know ourselves is through that, through that system. So from the micro, I think we need to look at what, and it amazes me that it is not, I think it's a false binary to talk about whether it is Google or our states. Neither should have this power over our lives. Battle for civil liberties, battle for freedom, battle for liberty of any kind is about other people not having control over our lives, not telling us what to do, not watching us all the time, not punishing us because they think that this is not how a person should behave, deciding what we are allowed to get or not allowed to get. These are really serious things. So it's not between, Google shouldn't have existed. And let's remember this too, that even as these things keep getting created, we thought the internet was a free space. We know now that it's a completely privatized space. It's not a commons. It is something that we are allowed to use, and on terms of how much we are willing to give it. And really the last thing, I think the debate on privacy has to move beyond whether my neighbor knows about me. Privacy is about personal security. Privacy is about national security. There is so much discussion that happens on national security. In the 80s, it used to be national integrity and national, a whole load of other things. But we are not even, and today they say, oh, all the instruments that we've got are from China, so throw them all up. And then yesterday, Colonel Matthew was telling us that, listen, all our data is being managed, controlled, and held by companies that are close to CIA and to FBI, to the Homeland Security and the French government and whatnot. Nobody is listening. So what is this idea of national security, where all of these people can have control over this, where especially we are finding, like when they talk about the vaccine now, and it's, unfortunately, I have to say it again, but it's Mr. Gates talking about the vaccine. And he says 7 billion people have to have the vaccine administered to them. So this is like a uniform prescription that is given. And that's why digital certification, that's why you have to carry it. That's why you have to be reflected in that system. That's why you will not have autonomy. Remote things will decide who you are and what you are and what you do. This ambition over 7 billion is a tech ambition. It is tech utopia. And it is that tech utopia that is also not okay. I'm not making a big pitch for whatever sovereignties exist, whatever, although I think they really deserve discussion and debate. But to have these tech utopias allowing themselves to be translated while we are juggling a little bit here and there is really not the way to go.
Thank you, Usha. So, as industrialization versus climate change is an interesting, very interesting point in the context. So, over to Parminder, and Parminder, I will. There are some questions to you.
I noted the questions.
Yeah, I shared the questions, but for the video audience, I will read out the questions.
Okay, good, sorry.
Yeah, because chat won't be visible to the video audience.
Yeah,
so there is a question from Usha. What are the resources of the digital economy? Thomas Franco asks what we can suggest government on data protection. Najiket asks, while one understands the argument of Uber drivers should get a share of the income that Uber earning from their data, or the Delhi should get access to data with Google Maps about traffic in Delhi, what about digital businesses like Facebook or Zoom? With whom should these businesses share their income from digital data processing? Who is the community that should own the data in the Zoom call? And what is the methodology by which benefits from the monetization of data on the Zoom webinar can be shared with the participants of the webinar? What economic rights should users or consumers, Uber riders are not just drivers, Amazon buyers, and not just traders, etc., of digital businesses have? Soumya Datta asks, like the industrial economy turned a large section of somewhat independent products into workers with little stake in what produced or how it is produced. Do you see the digital economy turning most of us turning into the intellectual productions and exchanges to being mostly without stake of what we do intellectually, probably already happening? Does that scare you a little as we Homo sapiens claim our uniqueness on that one aspect? So these are the questions to you. I think you can also pick the questions to all the speakers I read out earlier. So over to you, Parminder.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks,
it will be good
Anivar.
if you can be brief.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. There are lots of questions. I'll start with what, okay, the Industrial Revolution probably. I think, see, I myself, I'm getting old. I'm happy to go and live in a village right now. I mean, I'm actually giving up most of my technology things. That does not mean that I can impose my cultural choices on the people in general. I made this point earlier. I'm not convinced that in 1950, if we took this route of industrialization, that was not what most Indians wanted. Climate change, inequality. I don't think inequality has increased with industrialization. It has increased since the 80s. That's a different neoliberalization, which is different from industrialization. So all those things can't be put on that bag. Second, it is also a thing whether we really are saying, therefore, we want to live that primal rural living instead of the industrial living, which we are doing. These questions are real questions. Some cultural choices we individually may have, we can't impose on our constituencies. That's very, very important. And climate change is, of course, because we did the industrialization wrong. Nobody is saying that we should do digitalization in a wrong manner. Usha also said, but Anivar also about this commodification of data. We cannot be against both commodification and commonification of data, because we somehow try to just push back the data economy from us and say somehow it shouldn't exist. I'm sorry, I'm making an allegation, but for me, it looks like a true allegation. A lot of people still think that somehow it will disappear. If not commodification, a commonification. And what does a commonification mean has to be gone into. We need to have a seminar on what is commonification of data. Who would be the trustee? Who would be the managers? Who would be the regulators of that data? So nobody, I have not heard single discussion, and Anivar can tell me if there was ever a discussion in India on commodification of data. Why does not that exist? Because activists, in my view, and now I'm saying something bluntly, are doing a wrong thing. Usha said technology is politics. Yes, technology is politics, and nobody withdraws from politics, because the moment you withdraw from politics, politics will overrun you. In the same way, we can't withdraw from technology because it is politics. We have to bring our politics to technology, not deny technology as largely it is being done now. And that's important. Anivar said it's an extension of body. I think it's an extension of personhood rather than body. Personhood is different than body. And it's also extension of socialhood, communityhood, many extensions, like everything else is. But even human labor is an extension of personhood. Human labor also has human labor market. There is a employment exchange. We go and sell our human labor outside. Many things happen. The whole world is organized around labor exchanges. So it's not true that just because something is a part of our body, it does not enter the economic sphere. Labor enters the economic sphere. There would be no economics without labor. In the same way, the data also enters the economic spheres. And I think we need to nuance it. And again, my regret is that nobody is ready to talk about these things, even if to talk about what are the shortcomings in these things. The other questions, and probably go to the list which you made, Humanshu said about the marketplace. Humanshu, I think marketplace is where I actually agree with that commodification people. Data does not admit to the same kind of market exchanges as other things do. I don't know, for example, let's make a marketplace of location data. Google will still not sell its location data, even if you put a marketplace out there, because it is very valuable to be centralized and used exclusively rather than to be put out in the market. But yes, blockchains have some kind of roles of decentralizing power. On that part, I agree with you, Himanshu. Ashish is right that industrialization replaced primary activity and goes back to the industrialization question and did screw up a lot of things. I mean, there were a whole number of romanticist poets and novelists in the 18th and 19th century who really write about what we all lost when we came out of our pristine, living with the nature into these urban slums, which all cities are, even if you live in a 4-bedroom house. So I think those things have happened, and therefore I am therefore saying that it should be done in a manner which does not bring the problems of climate change problems, inequality, etc. And it can be done with equality, etc. It's very difficult to just turn it back, and not to engage with it would not help you make it fairer. That's for sure. Joseph said about individual control over data, etc. Yes, to a point, I think we have to also go beyond individual control over data. Till about 5 years back, it was the personal data which was the most important data. Today, anonymized non-personal data is actually almost as important, because artificial intelligence actually works on patterns. It does not work on individual data as much. And as I have said somewhere else, that there are two fictions on which digital economy works. One is consent and one is anonymization. And making it non-personal data. So while individual controls over through blockchains, etc., can work, they're very sophisticated systems. Normal human beings are not going to do those kind of things, and therefore we have to enter into certain kind of collective processes which are rule-based. I'm just going back a bit. I'll come back to other questions of digital divide and about whether we have lost our intellectual capacities. But something which was said by Usha. I'm not able to find it out here. Okay, I'll carry on with the. Now, have we lost our Homo sapiens individuality as being intellectual animals? I'm happy to answer those, what I class as cultural questions. It requires a long discussion. Yes, we are losing a lot of humanhoods in the manner in which we allow external forces in the name of conveniences to keep on determining our lives. And I think we have to be very, very, very deliberate. I'm not the one who is against deliberate. We have to be very deliberate what not to do, what not to take on, what kind of things are convenient but not to do. And yes, we are losing it, and we need to have very deliberate strategies of what not to do to not lose. I mean, if the robots are starting to paint in our place and they make better paintings than us, as somebody alleges, is not where we want to go. So I agree with those kind of issues. And I just want to answer one different thing, which if you that's what we're the climate change. Another thing is this is a defeatist attitude. Again, I'm sorry, it's become a conversation between me and Usha, which it always becomes when we are on the same panel. There's nothing defeatist about the take I am taking. I think defeatist is the other way around. You in 10 years realize that we should have been doing things which some of us are saying we need to do it. It's nothing defeatist. I am for not doing what is not to be done. And the rule-based state, we know the rule-based state has been dismantled, but does it mean that we give up the idea of the rule-based state? Is the question. Disbanding police, yes, disbanding police is like disbanding the state. And disbanding the state is a whole new series of, say, webinars which we need to do, which would find out or explore what happens if we disband the state and what happens to the interest of people. And the last point about interrogating technology is where I completely agree with Usha that we should interrogate every aspect of it. But this is only going to be possible if activists does develop their own convention, own convictions and own propositions about what a digital economy should be. It should be a coherent proposition of some kind and develop an advocacy plank over it. That advocacy plank today does not exist at all in India. And that is a regret. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Parminder. So, yeah, thanks for more perspectives into it. And anyway, there will be a lot of comments around that. That will invoke a lot of discussion, especially the discussions around non-personal data and all. I have a different take altogether, but I'm not going to that at this point since the time is limited. Maybe we will continue the discussion at multiple points, but let's go to Vineet now. Vineet, there is questions to Vineet. Ashok Chaudhary asks, is MKSS a mass organization or a service provider for government agencies or both? How it intervenes in exposing piracy and to restrict surveillance of people by the state? Lashmi JH asks, Vineet and Chatar Singh Ji, is the commission-based work on EMIT on completion of the service or just the initiation?
Yeah, to answer question about MKSS, it's a people's movement which has been crowdsourced right from the beginning. And what we mentioned about the customer service center is only a very small portion of it. And we got into it because a lot of services which government was providing was going to these license holders, what we call e-Mitra here. So because we work with people, they ask us how to get this done. We got into it to understand what the model is, how we can help people. And that also helped us in understanding that whatever model they are proposing is financially unviable. If you work honestly with the rates prescribed by the government, you cannot even get a minimum wage for one person. So we have been asking government to at least try some different model, at least have one customer service center in Panchayat which works free of cost, or increase commission, or some way in which people know transparently what the prescribed rates are. There might be very few customer service centers who work with government prescribed rates because it's financially unviable. Same is true with, somehow we got into one PDS shop. We got a license in our village and there's a committee in the village which takes care of that shop. Same was true with that ration shop. So these interventions help in terms of understanding what the model is and what the problems with the model is, and suggesting government how we can overcome those problems. So we are basically a people's movement, and a very small one. Chatar Singh is one person who works with that e-Mitra to make sure people get these services at government prescribed rates, at least at our customer service center. The second part was about, I don't know whether it was about privacy or piracy and surveillance. So one thing, we have been vehemently opposing Aadhaar due to some reasons, and one of them is also surveillance. We lost that case, Usha was there, and in Supreme Court, so that's a different thing. Apart from that, we have been trying to understand different technologies, like DNA bill is almost there, data protection bill is there, and all of these things are going to affect everyone. And the worst affected in these things are people who are most marginalized. So some of our perspective goes to see how these things will affect the most marginalized. And one of the ways of our expression are protests. For example, we put in a PIL wherein when government said you cannot have a dharna pradarshan in Jantar Mantar, we filed a PIL to open up that space. So it's, our work is very a big, broad work. The second part was about the commission-based work of e-mitras. So there's a fee for initiation of the service, and there are certain services where you might have to pay again at a later stage, maybe when something is approved or you have to print it out. So I think what the question was going to was quality of service, whether that e-mitra was providing a quality of service or not. And we have seen many people, they will just put the applicant's application, even if they know that at some point of time it will get rejected because some documents are missing or they are incorrect. Even then they will go ahead and process that application. So that again talks about the more you privatize, as I said, lesser the accountability of that person. So we have to ensure accountability even for e-mitras also, and it should be a financially viable model also.
Thank you, Vineet. So there is one question to Benson, and also Benson want to talk about some Kerala experience. The Himanshu Dhamle asks, what is your take on platform capitalism in post-19 COVID era? And there is one more comment from Kashok Chowdhury to everyone. Technology has always been in human civilization, but the problem and debate is on modern technology, which is directly linked with capitalism. Modern technology is primarily for increased profit and hence is always controlled by the capital and the state. It is used in continuing the political system based on profiteering and controlling people. Our systems are run by a control mechanism over common people. It's just more a comment. So yeah, let's Soumya Datta says disappointed with the way of presenting question, losing the essence of question. I'm sorry for that. Let's go to Benson. Benson, I want to talk a bit about his Kerala experience as well. Earlier time was limited.
Yeah, thanks. So what I'll do is, there was a question earlier also about like the market and a free market kind of a setup. There are things that a market can do over here. But I would say that one has to pay a lot of attention to institutions, which we often neglect. And one real part of these institutions are property rights. That's what makes markets work, so that we have well-assigned property rights and things function in a certain way. Now here, we have to strive towards establishing property rights. As Parminder also said, maybe there are situations where private property rights may work, but commons and treating data as commons is not something that we can ignore. And maybe a mix of both is basically what we need. Once we set up that kind of infrastructure, then I'm someone who believes that there is incentives are really powerful, and we bring in the right kind of incentive structure. There are things that we can work through a market, and this could be through the platforms or even otherwise through further digital transformation and digitalization that basically happens. I'm also someone who finds it extremely problematic to assume things about others' preferences, and when we talk about usually it takes the form of assuming that the others also prefer something like this. So I would say that what exactly are we going to compare a non-digital with, or a non-industrial with? So that's extremely something that is extremely important. What is the counterfactual that we are really trying to bring in over here? The real counterfactual to something like that is terrible living conditions. So I'm not someone who is okay with that, and I found it fundamentally problematic when we start sort of assuming preferences of others also. Now, I think a fundamental a good example here could be Kerala. This is a more general sort of a comment, and I'll come to the one specific thing where I also wanted to ask and maybe carry on this discussion later with Vineet about something. Now, Kerala is a state which everyone makes fun of the left over there as shouting slogans of computer go back. but they were also the first one to, and when people make fun of this and talk to me also, I say, yeah, that kind of technological anxiety is something which is natural for a political party where the cadre is the working class. When technology was sort of coming in, you were naturally worried about certain disruptions that was going to take place. But Kerala was also the state which started the first techno park. And the same sort of left government sort of started that. What I really want to know is in the programs that Vineet and Chhatra Singh is also associated with, could it make a difference if we start with e-literacy as a focus before we jump straight into service providing, and then that's also going to open up some kind of other dependency. You're still dependent on a certain service provider sort of sitting over there, maybe with you being not fully aware of what exactly is happening. That's where the Akshaya project of Kerala, which started in the Malappuram district, which is then a backward sort of district, in 2002, becomes important as maybe something that we could borrow from. So it started as an e-literacy project, and now it has reached a stage where it has become a service provider of multiple sort of government services. Now, the Akshaya mission starts in Kerala in 2002, and now has been extended to the entire state on a scale which is much bigger. It brought the state government, it brought the local self-government institutions and village level entrepreneurs to one platform, right? And it has been noted for the citizen participation a lot. And it now functions as a network of common service centers, which deliver a multitude of government to citizen, government to business, and business to citizen services. But the starting point and the attrition rate of entrepreneurs is very low. So it definitely something that is working for people, village level micro entrepreneurs who have come in, individuals, women in many places, and it has created further employment also. But it all started as an e-literacy mission, first in one district, and then it was expanded to the full state, making the state sort of, making the state also the first illiterate state. Of course, there are going to be problems or sections of the population which was left out, especially the tribal population. But there is something that was working in a slightly different way, where the focus was first on illiteracy, and then combined it with service providing, etc. Then the one who is coming to you is also reasonably sure of what he is coming in for, and the level of dependency is sort of further sort of reduced. I strongly feel that we should be prepared for something like this. It's not a defeatist sort of an approach to say that it's going to happen. It's reality, and we should not be left behind. And farmers in several places have benefited from technology. Fishermen has benefited from technology. There are ways in which this is basically going to do. It's not a blind faith in the market, but it's understanding the imperfect market also, and maybe the market and the free market can serve as even in economics, I would say it only serves as a benchmark for certain results on efficiency and nothing more. But it's a misreading that gives rise to this common sort of notion. But I think there is a lot that we can learn from very local level efforts that have happened all around the place. And maybe when you have threats of the supply chain being disrupted, the long supply chains, etc., and we are asking for more smaller local, but I still feel that digital is something that's going to be something that we have to live with. It's there. I think we should be prepared in order not to be left behind, and else it will be a serious injustice to many who will be left behind as a result of this huge divide which is already there. And I think learning these lessons and maybe not repeating certain mistakes that we had when it comes to inequality that happened in the especially after the 80s, the Reagan Thatcher era, and all about what is a place that we certainly sort of give to market and capitalism is basically a lesson that we have to learn, and a mistake that we should not repeat. That point I think is something that I'm clear about, but I personally feel that we have to prepare ourselves better. Given the population that's hugely dependent on certain traditional sectors, which are undoubtedly going to be disrupted over here. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you all the speakers. I think digital economy is still an emerging topic, an emerging discussion among the civil society. anyway the digital is anyway evolving. At the same time, what will be the digital? Is it a centralized digital or is it a distributed digital? Will APIs and centralizations and continuing registries will be the defining points for a state-citizen relationship or not? All these becoming a complex questions. And there is parallelly, there is evolution of blockchain-based model. Parallelly, there is DID kind of new open web models coming in, while even on the trust economy models, does the trust need, is there an intermediary needed or not? All these are complex questions. This is so how crypto will change the segment. This is one side it is a tech question, one side it is a policy question, other side it is an inclusion question. So there is a lot of confusion as well as evolution around the segment. And is it data is going to be crucial? Protocol is going to be crucial. Is it who need to control the protocol? It need to be distributed or it need to be centralized? It need to be, does it need to be, what is the state's role in this? The state should always become an intermediary for all citizen transactions between businesses and citizens. So these whole questions are evolving. And along with that, how to make sure that everyone will have a participation rights is also getting important. So digital literacy always have an important point, but at the same time, digital literacy models is also having criticisms and positives. So personally, I have involved with some of the digital literacy initiatives with Saksharata Mission and all in Kerala, but that didn't fly well. That system itself have its own problems. And digital literacy for the state is now mostly about last mile cash transfer and literacy around it, or identification tech around it. So those kind of complex questions are anyway evolving. And there is always warnings, there is always a threat of surveillance, there is always a threat of more state is pushing platforms to be intermediaries between business citizens and business, along with, and there are always also business collectives evolving as policy lobbying force. So this is a complex thing. So this, I think we need to have more discussions around the segment, especially among the civil society, to build more solid ways in which engaging with this segment. So that's my input or my opinion on this point. There are a lot of people pioneering in this area, but at the same time, movements plus movements and welfare segment interacting with the digital rights segment is usually low. I think we need to engage more discussions in this regard. Thank you all for joining. I think we can close the meeting.
Thank you, Anivar, and all the speakers and the participants also. For the next session, which would be on 23rd, we'll be looking at accountability and transparency mechanisms in financial institutions. Kindly do join us. Thank you.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you.